the energy industry to evaluation, exploratory market research, and customer research, experience research. Her topical experience ranges from HVAC and water heating technologies to electric vehicle infrastructure, new construction programs, and the water energy nexus. So I'd like to hand over control to our speakers and start with our first topic area.
Thank you, Andy. Good morning, everyone. So Maass and I are here to discuss motivations for installing charging stations and how installing charging stations can drive EV adoption. The findings that we'll be sharing today come from research that ILLUME conducted for a utilities charging programs in New York and Massachusetts as a subcontractor to ERS, now DNV. As you can see on the slide, we conducted a number of different surveys and interviews over 2 years in Massachusetts and over 1 year in New York. Most of what we'll be discussing today will be coming from interviews with participating, non-participating, and prospective site hosts in both states, surveys of site host constituents in both states, and this could include employees, residents, tenants, or customers, depending on the type of business that the site host is, and then baseline and follow-up surveys with residents of 3 communities that had program-funded stations installed at multiple sites.
So you first want to just kind of lay it out there about why customers talk a little bit about why customers are willing to be site hosts and how important programs are in getting folks or customers to install stations. And what we really found was that across organizational type and station type, that funding from external funding sources were essential for driving these customers to install stations. And, we even heard that indicated that they didn't necessarily need to install stations for any reason, but they were heavily motivated by these funding opportunities, and folks wanted to take advantage of that. And to the extent where we kind of saw how this could play out is that customers that had multiple locations, this could be, across utility territories and also in states, that they would be seeking out and working with third-party vendors in order to prioritize where stations are going based on which ones had the highest available incentives. And so in this next slide, we can also just see how important incentives were that in making it possible for site hosts to move forward with the station. And we did talk to some folks about DCFC stations, that are the fast charging stations, and because some of the programs didn't have as robust of incentives for that, that kind of seemed to be a barrier for them to move forwards with those fast charging stations, that they had that smaller piece on it. And so what we really to dig into why the programs are so influential is it really comes down to this line of customers aren't in the EV business. So the revenue from people charging and using stations was not a key driver for these site hosts to install it. Instead, they talked more about environmental benefits, as well as providing amenities or services to their staff and visitors. With that, though, we heard from customers interest in focusing on working with partnerships with third parties or utilities to operate stations. And then we also heard this difference between how an organization how they generate their profit. So if it was more of a kind of a less competitive, less financially reliant on in-person visits, then that was far more of a discussion about signaling environmentally, that sending that environmental signal, as well as providing an amenity. But in this next slide on the quote, what we see here is that there is a difference for some businesses that rely on bringing people to their facility to generate their profit through that. So the station was a way to have that additional attraction. So in this case, we had a hotel that was describing that that financial value is really where it came from versus the charging itself, that revenue. So it would help draw people who have an EV to their hotel versus a potential competitor. And that could be the deciding factor. And with that, pass it back over to Shannon, who will talk a little bit about how this played out with the general population.
So yeah, so most of the findings I'll be discussing now will be coming from those surveys we did with the 5 site hosts and their constituents, with some comparisons to our general population surveys. So as you might expect, in both New York and Massachusetts, significantly more site host constituents have seen a charging station in their state compared to the general population. And we also saw that in the 3 participating communities who we surveyed in 2019 and 2020, that there was a significant increase in the number of residents who had seen the program funded charging stations between the baseline and follow-up surveys. So I think this is important because one of the key barriers to owning an EV is concerns about where to charge an EV. So increasing visibility is one way to help overcome that barrier. And then in surveys of employees at the 2 Massachusetts workplaces that installed chargers, we found that the availability of the charging stations motivated respondents to consider or purchase EVs, and it also helped increase their knowledge and awareness of both EVs and EV charging. 2/3 of the non-EV owner respondents from one of the sites said that having charging stations at work affected their likelihood to purchase, motivated them to learn about EVs, and contributed to their knowledge about how and where to charge an EV, at least to some extent. And then we also asked EV owners who had purchased their vehicles after the chargers had been installed if the availability of charging at work influenced their purchase decision. And all 10 of the EV owners at one site and 4 of the 5 at the other site said that it had. And then at all 5 surveyed sites across both states, we found that respondents who were exposed to charging stations at their workplace, home, or community, who were planning to purchase a vehicle in the next 2 years were significantly more likely than the general population to say that they were considering an EV for their next vehicle. But despite that increased knowledge, awareness, and interest in EVs among those that had access to them, we did see that the top barriers to purchasing an EV remained similar to those among the general population. So in both states, we saw that concerns about pricing and charging were the most prevalent barriers among the site host constituents and the general population. And we also found that in the participating community surveys, the concerns related to accessing charging stations and maintaining an EV's charge really held steady between the baseline and follow-up survey. So there were no significant changes there as a result of those stations. So I think that this really underscores a need for education among residential customers about EVs, EV charging, and rate structures, along with the access to EV charging to really accelerate EV adoption. And so the New York program was able to provide some educational outreach through both general market campaigns, and then as a requirement of receiving the incentives, site hosts participated in an educational initiative, distributing program provided educational content to their constituents through email, social media, or whatever means they had to communicate with folks. And across all 3 of sites, the majority of respondents who remembered the content thought that it was useful, and just under half said that it made them more interested in EVs, which seems pretty successful for unsolicited information about electric vehicles. So if you build it, they will come, not just a catchy conference session title, but this is a sentiment that we heard from site hosts in both states. And in fact, multiple used those words saying, if we build it, they will come. They believed strongly that EV owners would come in and make use of their stations. But this is also something that utilities and states are counting on as they look to electrifying the transportation sector to reach aggressive climate goals. And meeting those aggressive goals for numbers of EVs on the road in states like Massachusetts and New York will require infrastructure. And as we've learned, that will continue to require incentives for the site hosts. In our research, it was really too early to say that the program installed stations led to EV purchases, but it does look like it certainly led to interest. And like the saying is true, you know, we surveyed employees, tenants, residents at 5 sites that installed stations, and respondents at all 5 showed greater interest in EVs than the general population. So with the infrastructure bill, you know, this hopefully will really pave the way for that increase in EV adoption and infrastructure. All right, thank you.
Well, thanks to both of you. Really interesting work. We're a little maybe tighter on timing, so we probably have room for maybe one question if there's anything pressing. If anyone has a question, just I think raise your hand if that's possible. I'm not quite sure how this works, so I see one question in the chat. Constituents are concerned about maintaining an EV's charge. Can you say more about that? Maintain a certain level of charge, maintain a certain number of bars or miles?
You know, just among people who are not familiar with EV technology, there just seemed to be greater concern about, you know, how would they keep their vehicle charged, not only where they would charge it, but keeping it charged and, you know, being able to make it home from their destination.
Sure. Well, thanks. We'll hopefully have a little bit of time at the end for any additional questions, but I think we need to move on to our next speaker. Cade Lawson is a recent graduate of Georgia Tech School of Economics and a current master's student in data analytics. He works as a research assistant at Georgia Tech's Data Science and Policy Lab, affiliated with the Institute for Data Engineering and Science, where he has conducted research on the applications of big data and machine learning to questions in energy policy. I'll hand it over now to Cade to present his work.
Yes, thank you so much, Andy. And thank you all so much for being here. I'm super excited to talk to you all about some of my work today. It would be my co-author Camila presenting here, but she did the impossible and somehow finished a PhD early. So she's off working, and I'm super excited to be able to present in her stead. So what I'd love to first talk about is just some of the fundamental challenges that we currently face to understanding electric vehicle charging behavior, particularly in the workplace, but really in all domains. And the challenges we faced in trying to conduct this research is that sub-metered EV charging data is exceedingly rare. It's not published. It's sometimes not even collected. And it's additionally pretty unclear whether consumers at EV stations respond to marginal prices or really care that much about the price they're paying for electricity to charge their car as much as they would at a gas station or any other place to fuel their internal combustion engines. So knowing this, we've already seen congestion effects in our space constrained environments like EV charging stations. And so the focus of this paper is going to be figuring out ways to promote resource sharing at EV charging stations. So we focus on 2 primary mechanisms. One's going to be a monetary incentive that I'm going to call a marginal pricing intervention from now on, and also a non-monetary incentive, which is going to be called a normative messaging incentive. And just to situate kind of the importance of EV charging in the workplace, about 50% of people say that the ability to charge at work is one of the most important factors in their decision to purchase an EV. So it's very important for the diffusion of the technology into the general population. And there's a lot of key benefits to workplaces and employers of having EV charging stations available. So there's higher rates of employee retention, of course, higher EVMT, electric vehicle miles traveled, and also the promotion of corporate sustainability goals for an individual company. And meanwhile, on the flip side, some of the challenges workplaces have faced in the diffusion of this technology are their own policies, so administrative barriers to kind of incurring the high capital costs associated with installation, and cost recovery, because much of the time recovering costs of these stations is kind of a secondary goal behind just providing a workplace perk for their employees, in addition to the congestion effects that happen as well. So our field experiment will present data from one of the largest workplace charging programs in the US. It was set up by a very large manufacturer in the American Midwest, which installed about 200 stations for its employees and plans to install 600 more by 2019. The data we present is from 2014 through 2015, so very early on in this firm's adoption. And their goal was to have these stations serve as an employee benefit and also to promote EV use and adoption. Now, to just kind of give a brief background of some of the existing tools or mechanisms that people can use to sort of limit this congestion and try to offload the peak wait times and consumption levels at EV stations. So from economics, we think that marginal pricing increases should be an effective strategy to limit this consumption and deter it. So just simply raising the price alone, in theory, should be enough. If we know anything about economic theory, it's never wrong, definitely. Don't fact check that. Except for when it is, because sometimes consumers respond to average rather than marginal prices in their energy consumption behavior. And lastly, our previous behavioral conservation studies have found that there are non-price motivations, so especially pro-social messaging, that can be really strong motivators to curb energy consumption and promote resource sharing and hopefully the adoption of EVs in general. So the way we were able to design the experiment was using or testing these two different mechanisms I've been describing. So the first is the marginal pricing mechanism, and we're able to test that because of the way that the firm structured their prices with their EV charging. So because it's a workplace perk, it was free up till 4 hours, and when 4 hours passed, employees were charged a 50-cent fee, and then an additional $1 per hour fee from then on. And in terms of our normative messaging intervention, the firm actually sent these behavioral messages to its employees pretty regularly to remind them to do things such as be great ambassadors for the firm, be good corporate citizens, and to be courteous to fellow employees. And so that's what we call our normative messaging intervention. So using the data we have from this firm, we're able to test the impact of both of these interventions separately, and also really importantly together, because existing theory would indicate that it's possible for this normative pro-social kind of messaging strategy to fully crowd out the effect of the price strategy. So there was a world where we could expect to see only one or the other of these two strategies working. And so the goal was to determine if they were in fact complements as well as being effective strategies on their own. And the way we were able to accomplish this was using regression discontinuity and essentially observing kind of how a given user's charging behavior changed around these two cut points. So these two figures here show the specific data we were working with. It was really high volume data of about 4,000 sessions from 2014 and 2015. On the left, you see the effects of our marginal pricing experiment. That happened at 4 hours, which is when the price began to be incurred. So we expect the treatment to happen right at 4 hours for a person who's going to unplug their vehicle in response to that policy. And for the normative messaging strategy, we expect that to be at about 2 hours after an interview with the station operators, who told us that that was about the length of time it took for the average employee to recoup the electricity cost of their commute. So the hope is that sending these normative messaging interventions will help employees to unplug their vehicle at 2 hours, which is what we do find evidence for here. And so in terms of the actual results, we found pretty strong effects for both of these interventions. So the price effect, raising the price even incrementally, or what I would call nominally, a very small, definitely not market rate price increase, resulted in about a 14% decrease in energy use by employees. And the behavioral effects, so sending these behavioral messages had an effect size of about 19%. So between those two, we find evidence that they are not only strong deterrents for overuse and overconsumption of these EV charging resources, but also that they work together really strongly and are strong complements at very low cost to a firm, particularly in the case of the behavioral messaging intervention, which is essentially a free way to address this problem of congestion and overconsumption. Oop, not sure what happened there, but we also find an implied price elasticity of demand for charging, which is about -0.04 to -0.13. The really interesting part about this is that it's in line with the estimates for residential energy elasticities, but not at all in line with the elasticities for users at gas stations. So we find behaviors or consumers in this area are behaving a lot more like people behave when turning off the lights at home than they are when filling up their cars at a gas station. And another kind of unique aspect of this work that was enabled just by kind of the granularity of the data we had was we could test kind of the robustness of these effects over time. So what I've shown here is the over time effects for both our monetary incentive and our normative messaging incentive. And what we see is that they do persist over time. And that's a unique and encouraging finding, just because throughout the rest of the literature, there has been evidence that especially normative messaging interventions are very effective early on and then taper off as people become maybe a little bit overexposed to the rhetoric or start to disregard the emails entirely and go back to doing whatever was most convenient for them in the first place. But we find evidence that particularly that normative messaging intervention are strong from a very early point and then sustain pretty strongly throughout the entire course of our study. And so in conclusion, what we find is that both of these two strategies are effective and complementary to encouraging resource sharing. One fascinating thing that we figured out by looking at a subset of managers is that the managers of this firm actually have a much larger response to the behavioral mechanisms and no response at all to the price. So when we were able to look at who these employees were, it became very clear that managers were much more concerned, we believe, with things such as image and being a good corporate citizen and a good example, and less concerned with responding to this very small nominal price increase. And that's very much in line with the existing literature about leadership and management in the workplace as well. And then lastly, we don't find any decaying effects throughout the study period. So that, as I mentioned just a moment ago, is distinct from other research, which has found the effects of these types of interventions to decay kind of quickly, whereas ours persisted through the end of our study period. And as far as what these policy implications are from this work, the biggest thing to be needed to continue this type of research is to have better data sharing standards and to increase sub-metering, or the practice of implementing sub-metering at future installed EV charging stations to really understand the way consumers behave. And we find that normative messaging interventions are strong complements to price incentives in the workplace, which we think can generalize certainly to other workplaces, but likely not to other points of interest such as retail, where there are lower levels of community building and less incentive for somebody to respond to the message that your behavior impacts somebody else, since that person in a retail setting or elsewhere is more of a stranger. So thank you all so much for your time. This work has been published in the Journal of Industrial Ecology if you're interested in reading more about it. And our data set is fully open sourced and documented in a data descriptor article in Scientific Data. So we would love for you to use that as well. But thank you all so much for your time.
Thanks, Cade. I think very terrific work, very interesting. There are a couple of questions in the chat. Margaret asks if there's any difference between the two normative messaging strategies.
Sure. Did you say between the two? So between those two messages, essentially, I believe is the question.
I think so, yes.
Yes, absolutely. So we consider all of this to be, or all of the different varieties of messaging they sent in this area to be a part of a singular normative messaging strategy. They have different wordings to it where maybe a different manager will type out a different message and send it each week. So there were actually even more than just those two sent out, but that was just a convenient subsample of the messages employees were shown. So there's no designed difference. It really is just up to the human writing it, what the actual message says each time it's sent out.
Great. And the next question is, did it matter in the case study workplace if the workplace had an on-site cafeteria or not? Asking because it's more likely to be in a position to unplug 2 to 4 hours into the workday if someone had to go off-site for lunch.
Yes, that's a great question as well. So we actually don't have granular enough information about what types of buildings were at each facility. We just know what each facility was. So for example, we know if it was a research facility or a manufacturing facility, but we don't unfortunately know if there were dining facilities or something like that within them. So that's a great question, but it's something that's unfortunately just a little bit outside the scope of the data that was available to us.
Understood. Maybe one last question. Are the interventions continuing after the test period?
Yes, absolutely. That's a great question as well. So one of the great parts about this experiment was that it really did occur naturally. So the firm was actually doing all of this of its own accord and without kind of any encouragement from researchers or anyone else. So they actually started this day one of their program and have continued it to this day. So probably in about year 7, they're still employing the same strategies and the same messaging, or the same price strategy and the same messaging. So it was not really designed to be an experiment. We just had the luck of being able to observe it through the data.
Great. Well, thanks. Just a few seconds before we move on to the next speaker, I want to note the polls. It's interesting to see that there is a fair number of people willing to pay the same price for filling an EV as filling a gas tank. A little surprising to me because of some of the benefits of EV ownership is a reduced cost of fuel. Also, the prior poll, just slightly over half of the respondents in this group noted that there is EV charging in their neighborhood, but a fair number were not aware of whether there was EV charging. So I think that that can be informative and is relevant to some of the presentations that we've seen so far. I'd like to introduce the next speaker. Michael Maness is an assistant professor of civil and environmental engineering at the University of South Florida and a core member of the Center for Teaching Old Models, New Tricks, TOMNET, Tier 1 University Transportation Center. His research interests are in the methodology and application of behavioral modeling in urban and regional systems. Michael has performed research in the area of alternative fuel vehicles for over 10 years and specializes in mode choice modeling of electric vehicle owner behavior. Michael also performs work in other aspects of travel behavior, particularly social sustainability and leisure travel. His dissertation, entitled Choice Modeling Perspectives on Social Networks, Social Influence, and Social Capital in Activity and Travel Behavior, was awarded the 2015 Eric Paas Dissertation Prize by the International Association for Travel Behavior Research. So I'd like to hand things over to Michael and look forward to his presentation.
Oh, hi, if you can hear me. Today I'm going to talk about well, kind of contrast is what we're just done. I'm going to talk about actually giving people charging for free. What our goal here was to give a first national estimate of what people may value in the EV charging events. This work was done by myself, my student Divyamitra, Mishra, Zinhong Lin, and Natalia Barber. Okay. We also had some other research assistants on the team, and that was Divyamitra and Madison. And we have some funds from DOE from the Transportation Energy Evolution Modeling Group at Oak Ridge, as well as funding from TOMNET. So a big motivator for this, and I've also heard a presentation yesterday as well, is that people actually wouldn't mind getting public charging for free. So it would actually encourage more people to use public chargers. So our question became well, how effective would a free public electric vehicle charging policy be? And what we're gonna do is try to answer that question to some degree, or provide the building blocks to help answer that question. Okay, so things have an inherent value. So let's say you have a $10 gift card. So it has some inherent value. Here it's easy to determine because it says its value. But so if you offered it at a price of $10, it's well, I didn't get anything from spending $10 to get a $10 gift card, right? So you got no perceived benefit. But if the person gave it to you for $1, so it only cost you $1, you might say, oh, I got $9 of perceived benefit, right? I gained $9. But what happens at 10 at a free, right? So if I give you the $10 gift card for free, do you see it as being worth $10? And what we're actually research has found is that people don't actually see it as worth $10. They see it as worth something more. So there's this zero price effect, and it's this phenomenon where a product or service becomes more desirable with a significantly increased demand when its price is precisely zero, as contrasted to when its price is marginally higher than zero. Some people also call this a value of free I played around with trying to call it the willingness not to pay. But this can happen for a number of reasons. These include like affect, transactional costs or effort, mapping difficulties, social norms, and prospect theory. And if people are interested in why those would be explanations for those, I have like slides in the appendix. So what we believe, or how you can model this, how this is occurring, is that there's actually a discontinuity in your perceived benefit, and that's at precisely at the price of 0. So your evaluation is significantly higher at this point. So we will call that the 0 price effect, or the value of free. Whereas if you offered it to the person for just slightly more money, they would not gain any of this benefit. So from past research, there has been some limited study on how free charging affects people's charging behavior. So there some work. So people do acknowledge that people do actually like free charging, and most of the work has been mostly in workplace charging so far. There has been some project work 5 years ago that showed people were actually willing to pay more for a car if they were offered free charging as a policy in the town as well. But in terms of like trying to analyze this, what the actual value of the free charging is, it's been kind of limited because there's low variation in charging price data in some of these studies. Also, some of the studies just didn't include a free price indicator, so it's kind of hard to determine the discontinuity that's going on there. Or there's no cost variable for non-free charges in some people's work. So in some exploratory work that me and Zhenhong Lin did, we were trying to simulate vehicle purchasing for a 10-year program that offered free charging. And we assumed that like maybe there was like a $1 0 price effect every time you charge your vehicle at a free charger, at a public charger. And we found that that could possibly lead to an efficiency of about $10 per metric ton of CO2 saved. So then we were like, okay, well, let's try to actually see if we can kind of measure this and see if that order of magnitude even realistic. Okay, so in general, we've looked at, we did some qualitative study of charging behavior. I have a student that was, undergrad student that was working on interviews for that. Here, I'm just going to emphasize that we did 2 stated choice experiments. The one I'm going to emphasize is the one on charger choice. And then I'm going to establish some distributions for the 0 price effect from the charger choice experiment. Okay. So we use a probability-based internet panel. So we use NRRC, and we did this last year from July to August. This included civilians, non-institutionalized adults 18 years or older across the entire United States. We had about 1,100 people in this survey, but 800 of them got the charger choice experiment, and the other ones got the vehicle choice bundle experiment. And then I guess this was a self-administered web survey and took about 10 minutes. Okay. So here's an example of what scenario looks like. So they were told, this is instructions, that they had a leisure activity that they went to, and that on their way home, they noticed that their car would not make it all the way home. So they're 20 miles from home, and their range is only 10 miles. So they absolutely have to charge their car before they get home. But their schedule is free over the next 3 hours, so they don't really have a timing constraint. And then we give them 4 attributes to consider: the cost of the charger, the time to charge, the round trip detour time from their most direct route, and some amenities at the station. So here's an example of what this will look like. So in this case, you can see charger A is free. It's going to take you about 35 minutes. Whereas charger C is $1, it takes you about 30 minutes, and they have different amenities. Actually, in this example, charger B looks not all that great because it costs $5. It takes longer, but you're at a restaurant, so maybe you don't mind the time because you're at a restaurant. So we varied these across 24 scenarios. So we started with an orthogonal design. We did a trial survey, and in the trial, we took the scenarios where a choice was dominating. So like 95% or 90% of the respondents chose that choice, chose only one of the chargers, and then we redesigned those scenarios to make the alternatives meet the alternative chargers like more comparable. So this is an unlabeled experiment with 3 charging alternatives, and they were given 12 scenarios per respondent, so that divided into two blocks. So attributes for costs, we have free, and then we need to include a price that's slightly greater than free. And then prices go all the way up to, I believe this is slightly off. So I think they only go up to $6. So this was the original design. I think we only went up to $6 afterwards because their values of time weren't sufficient to make $10 worth it. And then charging time is 15 to 60 minutes, and then they can have some detour time as well. And their amenities at the station included a parking lot, a convenience store, a restaurant, or a shopping mall. Here's some unweighted sample characteristics. So they're spread across education level, formal education levels. Gender mix is pretty similar. I mean, it's pretty almost 50-50. And then household income was, I think, a little, it did stray a little bit towards higher income individuals, but again, we do weight this there. So NRC gives us weights to correct these. We don't actually know what the true weight for a number of people have driven an EV before, but in our sample, 12% of the people had actually driven an EV before. Okay, so the modeling methodology we're going to use is a latent class discrete choice model, latent class multinomial logit. So what's going to happen is that each class is going to have a separate multinomial logit. So their utility depends on the price, as well as an indicator of if the price is free. So we can use this indicator that the price is free with, this coefficient for the indicator the price is free with the price coefficient to get a value of free or zero price effect. The full utility includes the other factors as well. So it includes the charge time, the detour time, and then indicators for the different amenities. And in this case, we did class membership was homogeneous across individuals. So each individual, so across respondents, they had the same chance of being in the class as the entire population. This not as much a delimitation in our case because we want a national estimate. So we don't necessarily, we just need it to be weighted properly for the distribution of across the entire country. Okay. And then what we're doing is that for each class, we calculate the zero price effect, which is a ratio of the partial derivatives. And then we weight them by the likelihood that someone's in the class. Okay. So we did this with a weighted MLE procedure. So the results that we are given are actually weighted to the general population. So the coefficient estimates you get are weighted for the general population. And then we did an exploratory latent class analysis first. In this case, we just keep increasing the classes and don't make changes to the model specification except for the number of classes. Some of the specifications are economically consistent across all the classes. So the price coefficients are negative and the price coefficients are positive. I mean, the free price coefficients are negative and the free coefficients, free indicators are positive. But some of them, they were not. So this isn't necessarily an issue. It's just that it can non-parametrically take into account that some people actually aren't economically consistent or that they don't take into consideration some attributes. Right. And then we also chose a model that was more explicit about making some attributes non-attendant. So some people just don't care about the charging time, or some people don't care that the price is free. So we accounted for that by actually creating classes where people didn't care about those attributes. Okay. So that also allows there to be heterogeneity in the presence of a free price effect as well. So here are some results from the exploratory latent class analysis. So I highlighted two of these, the 5 class and 11. So the first 5 class, so from having 1 class to having 5 classes, they were all the classes were economically consistent. Once we got to 6 classes or more, some of the classes had these classes where people had like a negative price coefficient or a negative free or a positive, they had a positive price coefficient or a negative free coefficient. Okay. So this one is the best economically consistent one, and this one's the best one overall. And you also see that the zero price effect kind of varies across them. So from a high of $1.67 for the mean to a low of about 62 cents. Here. We also did a model that had attribute non-attendance. So all of these numbers aren't that necessarily important for this presentation, but the things to notice here that so we had that the amenities. So sometimes people didn't care about the amenities. So in 2 of the classes, they care about the amenities, and the other classes, they are non-attendant to them. They don't care. Because some people just want to be done quickly, right? Or they just want to pay the least price, the lowest price. We have one class where there is the free charge indicator is absent. So this class, the people are non-attendant to the price being free. That was about 14% of the population. They're here and here. There's some times that they don't care. So some like 4% of the population didn't care about time. And then perhaps about like 1% of the population didn't care how long it took to charge. But and then you can see like this class here, 3 has about 42% of the people. And then in this class, their yield price effect was about $2.26. Okay, so we can get distributions across the three models that I suggested. So the first one with the economically consistent, all the classes economically consistent. We have a mean zero price effect of $1.13. Well, actually, I think this is the reverse. Sorry, this mean price is 79 cents. Right, because if we go back, it was 79 cents. Sorry. So about 45% of people had about $1 zero price effect. The one that had included economic inconsistencies, we can see here that about 11, 20, about 30% of the people had economically inconsistent behavior. But then that the plurality of people had class 2, and they had about $2 zero price effect. And this mean is actually $1.13. And then for the attribute non-attendant model, the mean zero price effect was $1.89. And like I said, 14% of the people had a zero price effect had no zero price effects. And then about 7% had a very high $4 price effect, and then the others are $2 and about $1 at 42 and 13% probability, respectively. So in terms of making suggestions of which one you would use if you wanted to consider these results, I actually think probably the attribute non-attendance model is the best because I think is more behaviorally sound. It's more explicit about that. Hey, I expect that some people are going to be non-attendant to different attributes. And also it gives it like 40% of people that have no zero price effect. So it's more explicit about what percentage of the people actually really don't have an effect, may not have an effect. If you're being conservative about like you want to have the least assumptions in your model, the best BECC model is probably the best. Like I said, it's not really a problem that it has economically inconsistent classes necessarily because it's kind of picking up this non-attendance, but it's doing it like it's just kind of trying, like it's kind of non-parametrically trying to get to it. So the reason that they are economically inconsistent classes is because it's trying to take this into account. And then the economically consistent one is just if you really need it, if you really want to be confident that all the classes are economically consistent, then I would suggest using that model. So brief discussion. So we presented here, I think, the first national US estimate of the zero price effect in EV charging. And our survey did found support of a zero price effect in charging behavior. Other research has actually found it as well. So, and then the willingness to pay values found were reasonable. So values of time within the range of people's wage rates. So that increases our confidence that the zero price effect we found is at least in the right order of magnitude. We did attempt to account for social demographic differences in class membership, but we didn't really find any strong correlations when we put them in the class membership model. But we could still go ad hoc, post hoc, and analyze the distribution of the attributes across the classes for different respondents, depending on how likely they would be in the class given their sequence of choices, since we have repeated observations from people.
Michael, I might have to jump in. We're out of time. We're going to have to move on.
Okay. Okay.
Really fascinating stuff, and I encourage you to stick around for discussion in the breakout rooms if possible.
Okay. Well,
thank you. Moving on to our final presenter, Matt Alexander is an air pollution specialist in the infrastructure modeling and analysis unit in the Fuels and Transportation Division at the California Energy Commission. Matt leads the state's light duty infrastructure planning and analysis and was one of the lead authors of the CEC's inaugural AB 2127 charging infrastructure assessment. Matt is also involved in innovative charging solutions, VGI, and interoperability efforts. I'll hand it over to you, Matt.
Awesome, thanks, Andy. Let me steal the screen share. Can you all see my slides?
Yes.
Perfect. All right. Happy to wrap up this panel here. As Andy said, my name is Matt Alexander. I work on charging infrastructure modeling and analysis at the California Energy Commission. And today I'm going to be taking a different perspective than others and talking about residential EV charging access. So wanted to start off really high level and just highlight some of California's key actions that have been happening recently. So, and I'm going to focus on the light duty side. But for light duty zero emission vehicles, we have goals for 5 million ZEVs in California by 2030 and 100% of passenger vehicle sales to be ZEVs by 2035. Right now, most EV drivers charge at home, where charging is convenient, reliable, and cost-effective. But as EV uptake moves out of the early adopter phase and into the mainstream market, we're going to see more and more people who can't charge at home. And so understanding how expandable this home charging access is and the key barriers involved is going to be really critical to our work in meeting the state's goals. So to better understand home charging access, we partnered with the National Renewable Energy Laboratory to conduct a survey to gather information on parking options, parking behavior, and to electricity. We collected nearly 1,500 responses from California residents. And over the next 5 slides, I'm going to show the key results and takeaways for 5 scenarios from this survey. We start off with the baseline scenario, which is called existing access. And here, respondents were simply asked whether they currently park near a 120-volt wall outlet. As you can see in this table, across the board, current infrastructure and parking conditions limit the opportunity for home charging. The existing access for all dwellings was only 25%. And this is particularly the case for apartments where access is even lower. Our next scenario built upon the previous one and asked people whether they thought a standard 120-volt wall outlet could charge an EV. So this looks at the educational aspect, and combining these results showed that over half of the people in our survey who said they park near electricity don't actually think they could charge an EV there. So this presents a perception barrier and lack of awareness of basic charging opportunities that could hinder EV adoption in the future. The third scenario added shifts in parking behavior on top of existing access to see whether people could park near 120-volt electricity if they were to change where they parked. So this caused a significant increase in home charging access. You can see across all dwellings, this doubled from 25 to 50%. But this was primarily the case for single-family homes, not multifamily homes. So the key takeaway here is that their shifts in parking behavior can increase home charging access, but this is primarily for single-family homes, and there's still challenges in apartments. Our fourth scenario focused on the ability for electrical installations to enable home charging. So on top of existing access, people were asked whether they currently park in a location where they think a new wall outlet could be installed. And in this case, the increase in charging availability was relatively modest and comparable across all housing types. We see increases in kind of the 10 to 20% range. That said, so we see there's kind of limited potential for new installations to increase home charging access, but it's also important to emphasize that the answer to this question in particular was from the perspective of the survey respondent and not a certified electrician. So there could be some uncertainty here. And our final scenario combined shifts in parking behavior with electrical installations to see whether somebody could change their parking location where they think a wall outlet could be installed. So this resulted in the highest overall charging access at 66%. But once again, we see multifamily homes still face challenges and barriers, and they only range from 26 to 40% access. So this just highlights the numerous challenges for home charging at apartments. But we also see that home charging is a challenge overall. And this is going to be something that we really need to think through if we're going to reach our goals of, having all of these vehicles be zero emission in 2035, all new sales. And so to explore this further, these survey results were used to develop a PEV likely adopter model and explore how residential charging access might evolve over time as the electric vehicle fleet share increases. So in the next couple slides, I'm going to build up this graph step by step again to explain the key takeaways. So the current curve here shows the evolution of existing access, which was the first scenario I presented, simply whether residents currently park near 120-volt electricity. Just to orient everybody, the x-axis represents the percentage of vehicles in the light-duty fleet that are EVs. So, 100% all the way on the right means all light duty vehicles in California are plug-in electric vehicles. And the y-axis represents the fraction of those vehicles that have access to home charging. So in the early adopter phase, PEV fleet share is very low and residential charging access is very high, as seen by the top left portion of this curve. And today we estimate about 800,000 or so PEVs are on California's roads. And this represents about 2.5% of the light duty fleet, illustrated here by the vertical line. However, as EV adoption expands into the mainstream market, charging access is going to drop dramatically. Going back to the state's goal of 5 million ZEVs by 2030, if we consider a fleet size of 5 million PEVs as a close comparison, we see that residential charging access drops below 50%. So this means that out of those 5 million vehicles, over 2.5 million are not expected to have access to home charging under business as usual infrastructure and parking conditions. And this, residential charging access continues to decrease all the way out to 100% of the light duty population. So if we add the other 4 scenarios I described before, we can see how these compare against each other. And so at the bottom, we have the worst case scenario where many people don't even realize they can charge an EV at the wall outlet they already have. And at the top, we have the most favorable scenario, which combines changes in parking behavior with electrical installations to reach the highest home charging rate. And these 5 curves highlight 3 key gaps hindering residential charging availability. So the first is education. I was seeing some chats about this on the Zoom. So, these results show that simply raising awareness and educating consumers about PEVs and charging could boost residential charging access anywhere from 16 to 33%, depending on where you are on this x-axis with the PEV fleet share. The second gap is electrical installation. So while it's likely that prospective PEV owners, especially those living in single-family homes, would plan to install charging, it may not always be the case. And as our results have shown, electrical installations at multifamily homes are an even tougher challenge. So this is going to require public and private funding to support installations at apartments or in public locations that could be used as alternatives for these residents. And the third gap is parking behavior. So this represents the largest opportunity for increasing home charging access, but is also likely the most challenging of the 3 to address, since it would require systemic shifts in individual behavior. Again, another consistent theme here is that, shifts in parking behavior primarily improve charging access for single-family home residents. So those living in multifamily homes still face significant barriers to home charging. And looking to 100% ZEV future, the key takeaway here is that there's an upper bound on residential charging access. There are going to be trade-offs for the amount of home charging available and the public infrastructure that's required. And we need to maximize home charging as much as possible where we can, but it's clear that we're still going to need continued public infrastructure investment and deployment to serve drivers who won't be able to charge at home. And on top of that, this study and the results I've shown today haven't discussed other challenges such as access to level 2 charging, which may be even harder than level 1, or growth in multi-PEV households where folks may only be able to charge one vehicle in their garage. Having a second vehicle might be a tougher challenge. So all this is to say, we have key decisions to make at the state level, especially at the California Energy Commission, where we are responsible for this charging infrastructure rollout. And we really need to provide convenient, reliable, and cost-effective charging options to all residents. And this is an ongoing question, research question, and policy question as well. So welcome any feedback, suggestions, or questions on these results and how to address these barriers. And I'll wrap up here by just saying thank you, especially to Eric Wood and Jan Bogi at NREL. I know Andy was also involved in some of this work. They actually conducted a national study. So the results I've been presenting today were focused on California, but they've recently published the results and discussion on their national survey as well. And I can provide a link in the chat to that. But Please feel free to reach out if you have any questions or would like to discuss this further. Thank you very much.
Terrific. Thanks, Matt. I'd like to thank all of our presenters today for some really terrific information. We ran a little bit long,